Thank you guys so much for having me, right? So I'm Tanisha Morton. I'm a pediatrician by trade, and that's what I do at work. I'm a mom, and I think that's my most important job. And so she's 11 going on something else. So I am navigating this as well. I'm on my faith work, I'm on my faith journey. And so when Kristen asked me, she said, "Hey, are you interested in doing something like this?" I said, "Yes, actually." As I'm trying to rebalance life and rebalance what things look like for me, my faith walk, my job walk, my work walk, my mom walk. I'm like, oh, this checks all my boxes. So yes, this gives me an opportunity to explore and then also share some things with you. And so I'm hopeful that we're able to glean some knowledge, right? And have an interactive talk. I hail from church here in Spokane, so I'm a member of Bethel AME, where my pastor, Benjamin D. Watson Sr., he's our fearless leader. And again, sort of walking me down sort of that faith journey and that faith path. And so I'm very, very interested in this topic of health and childhood spirituality. Are they connected? Are they not connected? What are we doing? Right? And where do we go from here? Yeah. And so this talk is meant to be interactive, so we're going to dive right in. I'm aware of timing. I talk really quickly, so there should be no issues with me getting through it, right? So I'll try to definitely sort of slow the pace, right? And so again, crowd participation is going to be key. And so we'll go to the first, and I think sort of only question for interaction, just based on um, there we go. And so I think if we can have perhaps three participants and you can popcorn to each other, right? So what does spirituality mean to you and your family? And who's going to be the first brave soul?
Give Jesus and music and more Jesus. Just it's just like feeling like you've gone to be with the Lord without needing to die. Yeah.
Absolutely. Jesus and music, right? And that's one way through music that we express our praise, right? And we also get our energy up. So yeah, Jesus and music. I love that, right? Anyone else want to share?
Honestly, I don't think that I've thought about this question more than we try and go to church when we can. But I'm sure Brian has thought more than I have.
Well, I feel like it's a lot of people say, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, and I always felt like the opposite of that. So like I don't really know what spirituality means as much as I know maybe what I think of Christianity as meaning. So yeah.
Exactly. And as I was exploring the topic, right, it's sort of like, I'm sorry, chicken or egg, right? And are they synonymous, right? Are they the same thing? Is it an action that you do? Is it sort of something that you feel, right? And so yes. So thank you. I
I
always
think there's,
believe, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I feel that there's like a meaning making or meaning seeking that goes beyond sort of the physical and observed and sort of like connection that you have to something bigger than yourself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always believe in sort of connection before content, right? Lots of things that we do, and it's helpful to see or hear what folks are thinking in the room, right? What does it mean to you versus sort of someone else? And like you mentioned, sir, maybe I didn't really think about this before, right? Until this question is posed. So here we are, and here we go. And in looking at different definitions of spirituality, right, it was more of a personal thing, right? And so it's a search for ultimate meaning. What does the meaning of life? What's self-awareness? Who am I? Self? What's my purpose? I'm looking for connection and I'm looking for where my values would lie, right? And so in pooling sort of several different definitions of spirituality, that's what I found. So it can include a religious practice, right? So Jesus and music, love it, right? But it can also include things like nature, family creativity, community, and that's more spirituality. I was invited to a church event, so I said, well, Tanisha, you know your audience, so it should include something around the lines of church, right? And so then I asked myself, well, what does the Bible say about church, right? This is a faith series, a faith family series. And so what does the Bible say about spirituality? And so this is a conscious choice. I'm choosing to focus my mind on spiritual being, and that includes how I follow Christ, right? And so that's my faith walk. That can include behaviors, different practices. So going to church as a family or not, sort of doing it over Zoom as we're doing it, as we are now, living by faith. And where is that trust? That trust that God is going to follow through, not necessarily in my time, right? But God is going to follow through and relying on God's strength. So when we sort of go backwards or what we lean back on, where am I looking? Am I looking to the hills, right? And so these are very adult concepts. So when we talk about childhood and spirituality, why is a pediatrician here? Why is a pediatrician here talking about spirituality? And is that too mature for a child, right? Because adult concepts of what are certain behaviors, right? Am I going to church? Well, a child can't drive themselves, right? Um, asking children to trust God. Well, what does that mean? And do they have a general understanding of that? So again, why is a pediatrician here? Well, I'm glad that you asked. I'm glad that you asked. And remember, we have to go back to Matthew 18, right? Who's the greatest in the kingdom of God? And he was a child. A child shall lead them. Children are born with these innate spiritual gifts to include openness, curiosity, humility, simple wonder and simplicity, right? Children are so innocent, and as we grow older, right, we are impacted by the world and certain influences, and then we lose that curiosity. I'm here for these three things, and that's it. Versus a child walks into the room, what opportunities do we have today? So there's certain innate born characteristics or spiritual gifts given to children, which start here. We really need to be more like the little ones. Because as we know, as it's quoted, those are the true disciples. So why would we be talking about it in childhood? The Bible tells us to, right? In 2025, and my pastor speaks of it all the time, right? The devil attacks us. It's a thought war. There's a physical war that's going on, absolutely, but then there's also a thought war. So as we are formulating who we are, who we want to become, our foundation, there's such spiritual deception and warfare going on in our lives right now. So this is not a talk necessarily just around spirituality in children, right? But spirituality in adults. Right? What are we thinking about? What are our strings that are being pulled that make us act one way versus the other? How is spirituality incorporated into child and family development? Those are some things we'll talk about. Is this nature versus nurture, right? And so, sorry, I have an 11-year-old, and so they speak a different lingo. And as I'm looking at my hands, nature versus nurture, I'm thinking, I don't know who has any teenagers in the room. It's 6, 7, like here nor there, right? Yep, it's a thing. It's a thing. So, is this nature or is this nurture or neither, right? And I'd like to provide you guys with some clear takeaways and for opportunities for parents and the church. How do we directly impact this? Yeah, Dr. Eric Erickson. So he was a clinician. He's a clinical psychologist by trade, who did lots and lots of work in sort of psychosocial theory development. And his theory, so it's formulated a lot how we think in pediatrics, in the pediatric world. How do children develop? To develop physically, right? And they also have this psychosocial development. So there's sort of your milestones, which include speech and gross motor and fine motor. And then there are these social emotional interactions. And it changes sort of based on how old this child is. And so his thought was that there are 8 stages of development where each stage of life it's associated with a specific psychological struggle. So as we look sort of in the 0 to 18 months, those are going to be our littles, right? We're looking at trust versus mistrust. This is a sense of trust through consistent caregiving. So consistent caregivers give us this feeling of security. Trust versus mistrust. This is established very early, 0 to 18 months. When we move on into sort of preschool age, so that's going to be that 18 to 3-year range, autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is an initiative. This is where kids establish their confidence, their cooperative play. They learn to share or not. This is where they form relationships and bonds. In the preschooler age, that's initiative versus guilt, right? And so, do I take the initiative or do I feel guilty for certain things? How do I manage my emotions and how do I understand my role within society? When we move on to sort of 5 to 13, that's our early years, early primary years, and that's industry. We develop some sense of competence and we work in sort of what are our social skills and what are our academic skills. And that's going to be sort of like in your 5 to 13 range. When you get up to 21, that's your adolescence. And that's where we start exploring our own values and our beliefs and our personal identity. Right after 21, that's where I stop, right, as a pediatrician. And then we move on to adulthood. So I brought this up to show you that as kids move through sort of certain stages in their lives, number one, based on sort of their chronological age, 0 to 18 months versus adolescence, there's certain things that they're going through and certain feelings that they have. And this is the foundation. This is such a critical time in kids' psychosocial development. And these are their formative years. This is the perfect time to talk about kids. This is the perfect time to talk about how you can influence them as their parents. And then also the church, do we have a hand in sort of helping to build this foundation? I think of kids as these empty vessels and they want to learn as much as they can and they want to experience as much as they can, and this is when they ask the big questions. This is when they ask, well, what's religion, right? Or why are we going to church every Sunday and we're there all day, right? Do you believe in God? Why does God allow some bad things to happen? And we need to sort of be armed in order to navigate these questions. And also, who do we look to for that help, right? We always look to God for help. We look to the hills for help. However, with our church family, how do we answer these questions or how do we even explore this in a comfortable way? Because I'm so scared to answer it incorrectly. I'd rather not do it, but that's not the answer, right? So when we talk about spirituality in childhood development, it's really this holistic approach. Yes, we're looking at their physical, absolutely, right? So there's certain milestones that they need to hit. There's certain preventative sort of immunizations. There's certain sort of physicals that they need to go through. But then there's also this spiritual development that sometimes because you can't see it, right, and it's invisible, we kind of miss it, and we miss the boat in some of their most formative years. So part of this is sort of understanding that these are sort of the pathways or the stages that they navigate, and this is when we as parents, we as a church, we as a church community can have the most impact in how they're developing.
Dr. Morton, I have a question on this. So with those stages, I just love it. And this is Kate. Often people will come to church or will come and ask me, and it's when their kids are in that mostly 4 or 5 zone. And that's when the kids start really asking these big questions, right? About what is heaven and what is Jesus and can I touch Jesus? And so I would just love your insight on like just a little bit more about that particular preschool stage of development and why kids become so curious about the intangible or the abstract or start to ask these questions.
Because it's almost like and I hate to compare it to something, it's almost like this big mythical thing, right? And so depending on how present you are at church or how present that faith is, because it's so impactful. So a person that prays every day, a person that prays every day versus a person that goes to church on Easter versus Christmas, right? So depending on how present that faith is in your life, then they're going to ask all the questions, right? And it's not necessarily just about sort of spirituality, but they're going to ask like, why do I need to eat green beans, right? Why do I need to eat? Because again, when we're in that preschooler age, right, then we're figuring out how do I take the initiative to kind of direct or control things, right, or to greater understand. Because previously they were working on language, right, so communicating to you my wants, my needs. Now I'm just really, really curious, and I'm curious about how this world works, and I'm curious in terms of who has the power, right? Because that's how they think about it, right? I know mom versus dad has the power, right? So I know to go to like this person versus that person, right? I know who's going to answer my questions the way that I want them. So that's how they start exploring. And in that sort of developmental stage, right? That preschooler stage, in terms of taking the initiative to figure things out. And then they also start feeling that guilt, right? They know right from wrong, right? They know right from wrong, but then they start feeling that guilt. And how do I internalize that, right? So then how do I ask those? Because we're in this society where you shouldn't feel guilt or you shouldn't feel pain or you shouldn't feel sorrow. Yes, you should. Yes, you should. And that's okay, right? And I'm going to help you navigate actually naming those emotions. I'll mention that a little bit later, naming those emotions, but then what do you do with them? So when I ask, is God real? Yes, God is real. Can I touch him? No. So I don't think we should give them misinformation. I think we need to give them the right information, but then how we steer and how we navigate that depends on sort of their next steps. Sorry, that was a very circuitous way of answering.
Great.
So does spirituality impact health? And we'll say yes, and in two major ways, right? Because when we start thinking about the holistic approach to medicine or the holistic balance of kiddos, we'll think about sort of like psychological and physical, right? And so from the psychological realm, helping to build resilience, mental health stability, and it also fosters like hope and a sense of belonging, right? We know that as far as a spirit-filled family or a spirit-filled child or sort of exploring and answering those questions, we know that because they have that background and that foundation in terms of this is my church group, this is my church family, this is this higher being that it's going to end somewhere and somebody's within control, that we know that those have been that's been correlated with lower rates of depression and substance use. We also know that if, and I'll say specifically faith-based spirituality, right? We know that there are better coping mechanisms and coping mechanisms specifically around adversity and navigating significant change. We're in this time of significant change where it may not be fair or it may not be right. But how do you explain to a child, this bad thing happened to this one person? Why did God allow this to happen? And they're going to ask that. And then you have to have that conversation around we have a higher being, right? And at the end, all things work together for good. And yes, some bad things happen, but how do we navigate through that bad thing? Do we default on being angry? Do we default on being physical, taking physical implications? No, no, right? This is when you sort of have those conversations around coping. We also know that as far as a stronger spiritual life also linked to different physical characteristics, right? So linked to healthier outcomes, healthier behaviors, I'm sorry, and better outcomes for both adults and children. So we know as far as whether you meditate, whether you pray, whether you take time to stop and reflect, right? We know that that is directly correlated with lower heart rates, lower blood pressures, which are then sort of directly impact cardiovascular disease. We know that there have been studies where they look at inflammatory markers around chronic diseases, specifically around cardiovascular health, and we know that those markers are lower. We know recovery and the understanding of I have things to do and I'm working towards a higher space, a higher being after surgical interventions. We know that folks with a more spirit filled or spirituality, right, that they recover a little bit sooner, just in terms of their motivation and how they're driving. There's active field of research specifically around three places. So mortality coping, specifically coping with pain, and recovery, actively being done by NIH, which is the National Institute of Health. And I know Harvard's their School of Public Health, they're doing lots of research or in terms of researching and navigating how people are sort of recovering a little bit better or what are the physical implications specifically around spirituality. I wanted to focus more on, so I mentioned sort of two places where spirituality can impact health, and one was psychological. The latter was more physical. In terms of your heart rate, your blood pressure, wanted to focus a little bit more around the psychological implications, right? When we mention the big emotions, I think it's important to name them: anger, fear, mistrust or distrust, And then age appropriately, how do we have a conversation around saying that number one, it's okay. So a 5-year-old being angry, absolutely it's okay. How does a 5-year-old respond? It's going to be a tantrum, right? Just because developmentally stages, that's how they know to express themselves. As we move closer into the school age, then we understand temperament, right? And depending on my reaction, I know that this is appropriate versus inappropriate. So remember that guilt stage in terms I know what's wrong versus not wrong. Then I know how to navigate there. And so spiritual practices that families can do together, praying together, and praying together again, not just on the major holidays, but the consistency. And I mentioned about all things. I remember my mom growing up, man, the washing machine wasn't working. We were praying about the washing machine. I couldn't thread this needle. That may have been eyesight in her older age, but I'm praying about doing this needle. So again, it's so important as far as establishing these spiritual practices in the prayer, right? Not necessarily just on events, but then throughout the day. It's also important to worship together. I cannot tell you the importance of your church community or your church family in being around faith-based folks with a shared faith, faith-based, because sometimes good things, bad things happen, and who do you rely on? This is going to be sort of like your family, your church family. Ensure age appropriate. So having my 11-year-old reflect on gratitude was an interesting experience, right? And so I said, Tanisha, you're a pediatrician. You should know better than that, right? And so we did it in a different way. In that daily, when we're pick her up from school, we talk about roses and thorns, right? Not necessarily what went well today or what went poorly today. What was your rose and what was your thorn? When we talk about gratitude, again, I sat down and I was like, she's very mature. We can do a gratitude reflection, and it did not go well. We ended up doing a gratitude tree every day, right? Every day you get to write something on this and had her sort of help build a tree and put these little cards out, right? Every day you get to write down what you're grateful for. Practicing gratitude is also a very amazing way, right? Just to sort of show that spirituality. Family rituals and traditions, we know that they also sort of foster a connection with and security. It provides a foundation in helping to build pride. And so certain traditions that you do, what are doing them as a family together, the consistency of doing them together helps to build pride. Certain cultural traditions, right? So I'm from the Virgin Islands. So I know, and I make it a point to take my daughter home every year. Right? This is something that you should be proud of. This is who you are. And I want you to praise yourself, praise your culture, because again, we're establishing these connections that are critical to support us, right? But then they're also critically important to fall back on, right? When we're getting into sort of adversity and uncertainty.
Identities. Like I feel like I don't know, as a kid, you're trying to figure out who you are. Like I assume in school, whatever, you're a kid who goes to church or a kid who doesn't go to church or something like that. Seattle maybe is a little bit more.
Can you say that first question again?
Yeah, how does it impact your identity as a kid? Like
Far as
spirituality, going to church, I don't know, religion.
how does spirituality impact your identity? I'm
You
just
don't
making
have
sure I understand.
yeah. Well, so when you were talking about going back, right? And you're from U.S. Virgin Islands going back. I think that for me, I grew up saying, oh, well, my family is from Texas and I'm Texan, or I am my dad is a runner. I was grasping for things to, figure out who I was, right? And I assumed religion was one of those things, but my question was how that shows up and impacts the kid.
Absolutely, it does, right? Because so you explored, your dad was a runner, you explored running. You either loved it or hated it, right? But you had the opportunity to explore, oh, these are now hobbies, right? And these are things that I can do. And so am I a runner? No, it's as important to identify who you're not versus who you are. I think it's important to sort of come back to your cultural identity, just in terms of that's who your foundation is, right? So you were born of two parents and they may be from different cultures or different places. I think it's critically important to explore both of them because with culture comes different sort of priorities, different values. And so when you start identifying or figuring out who you are as a human, you figure out what you do, right? So your skill set, right? What do I do well? What do I not do well? You also start exploring the emotional part of things, right? And so with identifying, and you see your parents around you. Do your parents get angry? Absolutely, right? Are your parents happy? Absolutely, right? What do they do when they're happy? What do they do when they're angry? And so some of these things that are modeled with parents or whoever is around your sort of society, that'll then model what's appropriate versus not. And does this fit me or who am I, right? And you don't figure out who you are or you don't figure out that identity without exploring different things. And so going to different cultures or exploring things with your parents or going to places like church, religion, that gives that safe place, that safe space to explore things, right? And to see different areas and to see different things. And that then directly correlates with how you identify, right? So if you grew up in a society where you saw evil, violence, right? Robbery, stealing. That shapes what that shapes who you are and who you start identifying with. If that's all I see, then that's likely who I am. Because, like you said, you're grappling and you're grasping for, am I like that person? Am I like that person? So if I'm only around this community or this space, that's who I identify it, and that's who's going to shape me versus when you start adding religion in there, right? And religion and church should be a positive place, right? Where we promote positive values and we promote positive feelings and happy and joy and cherishing and valuing you. So when you're surrounded by that, right, then I have other things to choose from and who I correlate with.
Thank you.
Mental health and spirituality. Sorry, I'm just looking at time. Got it. Mental health and spirituality. So mental health, it encourages, with spirituality, you're encouraged to take a step back, right? Encourage that self-reflection in terms of feelings, opinions, not necessarily just trying to shirk it away or trying to sort of put it away, but can we talk about it? Can we talk about the big feelings? Can we talk about the fun things and also the sad things? Can we talk about it? With spirituality, it provides comfort and it provides hope. Just because, and with spirituality, I'm either hoping towards, again, who's that meaning, who's that higher being where it exists, and who's my family, right? What are we doing together? Can I rely on them to be there in the times? Can I rely on them to be able to sort of go out for a walk? Because remember, spirituality is sort of things that we do and things that we feel. And I mentioned this before, it helps children make sense of the big questions and the challenges and societal changes, right? Politics, that's a conversation in my house right now, right? And I'm navigating, okay, Tanisha, we know politics, we're defining sort of Democrats versus Republicans and then why this is happening. But I have to be careful and I have to take that slowly, right? Because I have my personal feelings, but I don't necessarily want to sort of negatively impact her. And so that's interesting because I had a conversation with my pastor today. I said, listen, this is not positive and this does not feel good. How do I talk to her about it, right? Without sort of negatively putting my lens on it. And practical tips for parents, right? Just things that you guys can do. And I put it in three different buckets, right? So make, celebrate, and support. So please make time for the quiet reflection and the mindfulness as family, right? Meaning when a major event happens, I think we're a society that we want to move to the next step. And we want to not feel the bad things or not feel the larger emotions, and can we move past it as quickly as possible? And the answer to that is no, right? Just because it's in that quiet reflection, it's in sort of discussing the events that happen, the feelings that happen, that kids learn how to feel and how to navigate. Being a spiritual role model, right? So are you demonstrating your faith in terms of kindness, in terms of forgiveness? Share your journey. I went to church as a child because my mom said so. It. I went to church after that because then my husband said so. What was your journey? And there was a time that I sat with my daughter. I said, I did it because everybody else did it. or I did it because everybody else around me. But until I shared my journey in terms of things that happened to me, again, age appropriate how you share, right? That's also another way that you can sort of help. Celebrate the spiritual traditions and encourage curiosity. Have them ask the questions. Why don't we? Why? And there are some households that they don't have figurines, right? So we don't do Santa Claus at our house. Why not? It's everywhere else. It's at the mall. It's at my friend's house. Why, right? Support your child's questions about meaning, purpose, and belonging, right? So again, don't dodge or deflect, right? If you need guidance, if you have questions, typically I'll say sort of reflect to, do you have a medical provider that you can sort of ask these questions and how to navigate that question? Do you have a spiritual advisor? And that would be likely be someone from church to help guide you through this question. Be patient and be intentional. Sometimes this takes time, and this may not necessarily be a one conversation item, right? This may be sort of several conversations, but it takes that patience to navigate through it, and ensure you create a safe space, right? Just in terms of for them to be able to express their beliefs or their doubts, right? I can't touch God, right? How do I know He's real? That's okay to doubt, and that's okay to ask questions. And then we're going to go back to the spiritual text in terms of these are sort of the founding principles and the founding. So I wouldn't necessarily, like I said, deflect or dodge, but bringing them back without fear of judgment, right? Because the first time they come to you and they fear you, they won't come back. And that won't be a conversation again. And what can you do? So I said communicate. So communicate. And I say communicate your spiritual values to your kids, right? Do they know how you feel? Do they know what you value? I think people so often assume that kids know, well, we go to church, so we're Christian. Do you talk about that? Right? And how do you talk about that? So I would encourage you to talk about that. I would also encourage you to talk about it with your caregivers, right? I've had certain sort of bonds that I've had with certain patients where there's news, and sometimes there's good news, and sometimes there's not so good news. And we pray about it in the office. You never really know who you're going to be a blessing to or who's going to be a blessing to you. Engage in your spiritual activities, like we mentioned before, right? And so, again, spiritual activities could be things like walks, a gratitude journal, or a gratitude tree, depending on where you are, and your family rituals. Encourage them to ask the big questions and also to express their beliefs, right? It's only when they express themselves that you can see what they're thinking, right? And then you can steer, and then you can navigate, and then you can mold. Model kindness, forgiveness, openness, right? Prayer on all occasions, showing your adult trust and your dependence on God. Because again, that's what they're going to grapple with. That's what they're going to grab to. Hey, when mom is stressed, what does she do? Does she do exercise A or does she do exercise B? When you model that behavior, then that's what they reflect, and that's where they go to next because you're demonstrating it. When to talk to a person like me, right, or your other healthcare provider. I do believe that spirituality is a protective factor in individual mental health, and then overall, again, that holistic approach. If your kiddo is struggling with loss or change or big emotions, and it starts impacting like their daily things, right? So they're not eating, they're not sleeping, academic performance is negatively impacted, social interactions, so they're staying in their room a little bit longer, or you're noticing, well, you used to hang out with these friends and now you're no longer hanging out with them. That would be a time to, okay, do I need to seek medical help, right? Just to talk about where we are. And some resources, right? So this is a website that I love, healthychildren.org, right? So I'm a member of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And so I rarely direct my families to websites where it talks about the enzyme and the substrate. And you're like, that is not practical to my everyday. Healthychildren.org, it talks about everything from meal planning over to social emotional development or social emotional support. So healthychildren.org is a great one. CDC.gov also has a great one. Department of Health, if you type in sort of family resources for social emotional help or social emotional growth, there's some resources there. And again, don't forget your church community. And I'm going to say thank you. Sorry. And I heard it. Sorry, a question.
Thank you. We have time for some questions if anybody has questions to ask.
I have a question. This is Tanisha. Dr. Morton, you and I have talked quite a bit about vaccinations. And I'm wondering if you've encountered conversations with parents who are, because of their faith, opting out of vaccinating their children. And do you have any comments or any experience with that, how you navigate those kinds of conversations?
Yeah. So I'll tell you, this was a few years ago that the state of Washington, so I'll tell you specifically around measles, mumps, rubella, so MMR, there was a point where you could opt out because of personal beliefs or personal thoughts for MMR, and you could opt out of that immunization. That changed about 5 years ago, right? I'd have to date myself. That changed a few years ago in that it had to be a religious exemption, or you had to have a medical exemption. And reasons you would have a medical exemption would be if you had an allergic reaction, or you have an allergic reaction to either the components, or you had a poor reaction, not an allergic, but a poor reaction to sort of the first dose. That would be a reason for a medical exemption and the only other authorized reason to exempt specifically around MMR was a religious exemption. And so I noticed within my practice that all of a sudden we were having sort of families request a religious exemption. And that's, I will say, to be fully transparent, that was a bit difficult for me in asking because, on one hand, you don't question their faith, right? But on the other hand, the question is, what part of your faith will not allow immunizations or vaccinations? And that was for me understanding because I had to sort of then start exploring sort of different religious beliefs. So I will say that that's an ongoing difficult conversation to have. But then I get down to, okay, I understand that we're requesting a religious exemption. What part of your faith then, right? And sometimes I've had very thorough conversations, and other times I've had, well, I just need the exemption, right? And I can't deny that. I can't deny that. So, interesting topic, but yes, this is an ongoing conversation.
Thank you.
I have a question, just really interested in your opinion on this topic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So I have teenagers now who are in middle school and high school, and they initiated wearing crosses. And this wasn't something that I suggested or I didn't buy it for them. They bought it on their own. And they're wearing them to school. And part of me thinks this is a bad idea because this is Seattle, right? And it's a very kind of religion negative type environment. And I'm concerned that they might get bullied. However, I have not intervened. I kind of let it play out because I don't want to interfere with their spiritual identity. And if they're identifying this way, I'm really happy about it. However, it also really concerns me, the thought of them being targeted or treated poorly. So what would you do in that? I know you have a teenager too. I don't know if she wears crosses, but how would you react in that situation?
Good question. Thank you. She's 11. We're not in teenagedom yet. Holy moly. Holy, holy moly.
Oh, it's 6 months.
You, I would start with a question. Have you asked them why they decided to wear a cross?
I think they identify as Christians. I think they're proud of being Christians. I think they admire the people at our church. I mean, it's the only thing I can put it to. Like, why else? I don't think it's a fashion statement. So I'm assuming it's because they're proud of who they are. They're also aware that there's a lot of negative connotations, but they choose to do it anyway. So it's brave. So I don't want to,
So
interfere.
I'll back up to my question again. Did you ask them, right? So you're
No.
assuming X versus
Yeah,
Y. I
yeah.
would,
I've just
I,
been silent the whole thing.
would start with asking them why, right? Because they've been Christian for quite a time longer, right? Why now are you now choosing to wear a cross? And I think that answer then navigates your next steps. I think it's also important to be transparent with them, your concerns. Do they have those concerns or no? because we have certain fears as parents, that we try to protect them. This is what we do. As they're navigating adolescence and figuring out that identity, what I'm proud of, who I choose to stand to believe in, and who I choose to show the world. The fact that they're wearing that, I think, is amazing, right? But my question is, why, right? Is this a fashion statement? I don't think so. Like I said, I assume that they're proud of who they are, right? But have you asked them that question? And I think that then navigates your next steps. So the why behind it, of why you're choosing to put this public display, as your parent, my job is to help guide you navigate, but also to protect you. This is my fear. What would you do in a certain situation? Because have you had that conversation, right? So would it be sort of verbal bullying versus physical bullying? I would have that conversation. Hey, this is my fear. If this happened, what would you do? Or who would you go to?
It's good advice.
Yeah.
I would also just mention there has been a fair amount of writing recently about celebrities wearing these chaperones. Sabrina Carpenter have been wearing these like award ceremonies. So I think it's one ones.
So I would start with the why, right? Like I love it. I love it. But what's the why? And I think that but I think the other important part is, I think you have valid fear. Absolutely, right? We know what society we live in. But it's also important to arm them with what would they do? What would they do? Okay.
Any other questions? Dr. Morton, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We really, really appreciate it. This was absolutely perfect for our family series, and I really appreciate your time and being with us tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And again, thank you. This also helped me to explore some things as well, right? So it was a blessing to me as well. So thank you. I'm very fortunate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.
You as well. Bye bye.
All right.